Hi, everyone. Welcome to another museum moment. My name is Ellie Gettinger, and I'm the Education Director at Jewish Museum Milwaukee. It's my pleasure to speak today with Nina Edelman, who has been a committed volunteer within the community of Milwaukee and committed to Jewish Museum Milwaukee for a number of years. And one of the things that I love about this particular story is that it's a family story. One thing we do at Jewish Museum Milwaukee is we try to preserve and present history by telling personal narratives. And this is an excellent way of exploring broader stories around veterans, around World War II, around America at war, through one man's story. So today we're going to speak with Nina about her father, Max, and his story, which is quite exciting. So I'm not going to spoil any of it here. And so, Nina, if you could start by introducing us to Max Gendelman, who he was, and why this is kind of a unique World War II story.
Max was unique. He was a character. He was a Depression child with immigrant parents from Russia who grew up in a family where he spoke Yiddish, understood Yiddish. They had a shtetl in Milwaukee. The whole clan was there. And he was a very protected child. But he went to Madison and Pearl Harbor happened. And after that, he enlisted and then went to basic training. And from basic training,
How old was he at this time when he
about
enlisted?
20 years old. He was about 20 years old. And he was sent immediately after training many different places in the United States and having all kinds of experiences that a young Jewish protected boy would have, went to the Battle of the Bulge. And that was in December of 1944. And that's where basically his story starts. I'm not going to say adventure. It was not exactly an adventure, but it was his story.
I almost think, though, in hearing about Max, that he, while it's harrowing, in some part, was he like kind of a protagonist in an adventure story in his own mind here? On some level, did he have that sense of, was that how he portrayed it, or was it more that he really understood the extreme risk he was under?
I don't think he thought of himself as a protagonist. He was a person who was very decisive and he took risks and he really kept his own counsel. He didn't like the American soldiers, mainly because they were anti-Semitic and they were a rough crowd. And he just really kept to himself. He was invited to become an officer at every camp he went to. He took the intelligence test in the camps, and every time he was pulled in and said, "You've scored top. We want you to be an officer." And he said, "No, I want to be alone, and I want to not have to order anybody into their death." So,
What happened at the Battle of the Bulge?
well, there were quite a few soldiers there. It was the largest battle, and as Winston Churchill says, the greatest and most important battle of World War II. The Germans were wagering everything there because it was towards the end of the war, they were losing. So they brought out all of their ammunition, including horses pulling cannons. There were quite a lot of casualties on both sides. But in December 16th, they decided to launch an offensive, and the Americans were overrun. And my father explains fairly close to the beginning of the book how very soon there were no officers left and there was no communication with the headquarters. So there were thousands of American soldiers who were wandering around in the middle of the forest in Belgium and Germany, and they were lost, and most of them got captured. There were 23,000 Americans captured during that time. Most of them on one day. There were 4,000 captured on one day. Max was captured on December 18th, 2 days after the war started, after he had dug a foxhole and his fox mate died by sticking his head up from the foxhole. And Max had made friends with him that night, cold night, and he was a Catholic man. And so he died in Max's arms, and he Max said the Lord's Prayer for him, and then he said the Hebrew prayers just for good measure. So he ended up running and firing and hiding and sleeping in the woods, but eventually was caught second day and ended up being with a large group of American prisoners and in line to be questioned by the SS officers. Would you like to hear a little bit from chapter 4?
Right. This is from a book that Nina wrote about her father's experience.
Well, actually, my father wrote it. This is the book, Tale of Two Soldiers. My father wrote the book, not for publication, not for anybody else except for his grandchildren. And after it came out, people kept asking for it. Our relatives kept passing it around to people. And there were so many calls that we decided, okay, we'll just print it. So we ended up editing quite a bit, taking a lot of the family stuff out and printing it for general readers. So chapter 4, I was waiting in line to be interrogated. In front of me was a young Jewish soldier from New York with a name like Goldstein. He was asked several questions and then they looked at his dog tags. The SS shouted, "You are a Jew." He killed him instantly, saying, "Now you are a good Jew." I was next. "Quick, come here." I was about to be interrogated when there was a warning of some kind calling the officer away. The officer left and the rest of the SS were told to march to another area. There we were assembled to smaller groups of about 50 to 70, and we were taken to a nearby farmhouse. Now in the farmhouse, he describes how it was a very small place. There was no room to sit or lay down. They all had to stand against the wall. And they didn't have bathroom facilities. They didn't have food. They didn't have water. And somehow, some of them slept. But the next morning, at 3 a.m, they were awakened by an SS officer dressed in his green uniform, high black boots, and carrying his holstered weapon. He stepped around several men and went in the center of the room and shouted, "Aufstein!" Nobody moved, not knowing or understanding German. We just sat there. "Aufstein," he shouted again. Still there was no reaction. "Aufstein." Getting no response, he drew his Luger, placed it against the head of the closest GI, and fired, killing him instantly. Suffering from dysentery and hunger and regretting my status as a prisoner, I felt I had little to lose except, of course, my life. Max was funny. I got up and yelled, "Everybody up! This son of a bitch means business. Up!" That command they understood, and they rose to their feet. The officer looked to see who'd given the command. He saw me and said, "Come and see here." I did. "What is your name?" "My name is Max Gendelman," I told him. At this point, my brown hair was bleached blonde from the sun as a result of not wearing a helmet. I have blue eyes, and for all intents and purposes, I could have been construed as a German. My last name, if spelled with 2 N's, could be German. "Ah, yes, a good German name. Where do you come from?" "Milwaukee." "Ach, mein Gott, Milwaukee is a great German city in America." "Jawohl." "Max, you don't speak German too good." I shrugged my shoulders and raised my arms as if to say, "I know." And so he considered all of this and said, "Imagine this, a Jewish boy from Milwaukee being the German, he was then appointed German translator, leading a group of American soldiers, if they had only known."
So his dog tags, though, were blown off. So he actually had this, he could conceal his identity.
Yes.
Not easily, but somewhat easily.
Yes, he did. Mm-hmm.
But he is not in this. So his next part of the story is that he escapes from this camp. Is that correct?
He had many attempted escapes in every camp he went to. But from this place, the Germans asked them to dig because there were thousands and thousands of Germans and Americans that died right there. And the ground was frozen and they said, "Dig or die." They couldn't dig. So finally the Germans brought bulldozers in and they bulldozed the bodies into 5-foot-high hedges for many miles. And that stayed with my father. The stench and the vision stayed with my father his whole life. But from then they did a 7-day march in the cold to a place where they could get into a cattle car for a 5-day ride. It was the same kinds of cars that the Jews were transported on. And after that, then they were taken to different camps. Some were factories, some were labor camps. But fast forward to April, and they were transferred to a small farm in Linda, Germany, which is near the Czech border, far east, which became East Germany later. And actually Russia, East Germany. And that's where the story really begins.
Describe what happens when he's in this farm. How does he what is his new life like, and who does he meet?
Okay, he's with a bunch of American soldiers in a shed attached to a barn. It's at the farm of a lovely family called the Kirschners. And they had no choice but to do what the Nazis told them to do. They hated the Nazis. The father of the family actually was a teacher, and he had been teaching Jews secretly. He was a biology teacher, not Jewish. And somebody told on him, and he was conscripted into the army. Even though he was older, he had fought in World War I. So the mother and grandmother were left on the farm, and they managed the best they could. But on the farm, in a barn loft, there was a young man, their son and grandson, Karl Kirschner, who was also about the same age, who was injured. He was injured because he was conscripted to be a Luftwaffe pilot. He had learned how to fly during high school. And he hated the Nazis, and he waited for an opportunity. One day, he took one of the airplanes, they were small airplanes, and he crash landed it on purpose in a place where he knew he could walk home or crawl home. He was injured, but he was a naturalist and a hunter, and he knew the whole area very well. So he was hiding out in the barn. He was AWOL. If the Germans found him, he would be killed. If the Russians who were nearby found him, he would be a dead duck. And if the Americans found him, the same thing. He was desperate, but he was hiding out in the barn. So Max was hiding out in a way too. He did not socialize very much in the shed because the subjects that the men talked about were not of interest to him. And they were very jealous of him because he could communicate with the guards and made friends with some of them, actually, with conversation. And he was given the good jobs because the guards trusted him, and the men were jealous. So it was not a good situation. So he would walk outside of the shed. It was a fenced yard, and he would walk outside and just walk around and walk around and walk around. Well, Carl, who was high up in a loft, apparently saw him and said, what's happening here? Who is this? And one day showed up near the fence and said, psst, psst. Good morning. How are you? What's your name? He spoke English, perfect English. They learn it in school. And he said, would you like to come play chess with me? And of course, my father was quite taken aback. And he said, yeah, but how could I come play chess with you? And he said, at midnight, the guards leave, and I'll open the fence up for you, and you'll come through the fence, and you can climb up to my loft, and we can play a game of chess. So the first night he went, they played a game of chess, and the grandmother came in with sandwiches and sausages and cognac and cigars, and they played chess. The first game, my father won, which was not a good strategy. Unknown to Carl, my father had been the chess club president at North Division High School. And Max quickly realized he better lose the second game, which he did. They talked and they talked all night. They had a lot in common. They were both smart young men. And he said, would you like to come again? He said, under one condition. If your grandmother comes again with food, I will definitely come again. He went a second night. He went a third night. Now, right before the third night, the guard took him aside and said, you have to know why you're here at this farm. Why? You're very close to the mines that are in this part of the world, of Germany. And the Germans are building an underground government that they can escape to. And they need slave labor. And he got a little bit nervous because he said, if if these Americans are going underground, they will never be found. So that third night when Carl said to him, Max, we've become good friends, and I think that we have to do something together. And he said, what do you mean? What do we have to do together? He said, we're going to escape together. He said, what do you mean we're going to escape together? He said, I've worked it out with my mother and grandmother. We can get provisions. They can help us get papers and bicycles, and we are going to make it to the American lines. And once we get to them, you will be safe, and they will take me prisoner, and I can tell them everything that happened. So that was the plan. And they did. There were many factors and many dangers, but they did eventually leave together. Of course, they were caught. Of course, it was luck at the last minute with American planes strafing the German compound where they were. But eventually they made it to the American lines. Of course, Germans were shooting behind and Americans were shooting at them from the front. But this book is also about luck. And they made it to the American lines. Carl was taken prisoner and taken to Belgium, to a place where friendly enemies were kept until the end of the war. Max was interrogated and eventually was able to tell his parents they didn't need to sit Shiva anymore.
All of that, do you feel like, I mean, there's so many opportunities, the luck that plays out in so many different ways for your dad is just amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I think one of the things that's heartening is this sense of finding camaraderie and finding friendship in impossible situations. Just as we're wrapping up, how did they maintain this friendship? Because they didn't just say, okay, you go your way, I'll go mine. How did Max and Carl kind of maintain a friendship after the war?
Carl stayed in Germany to finish his degree in medicine, and they communicated. I have the letters, which is wonderful. And in 1952, my father sponsored him, brought him to the United States. Of course, there was unbelievable disaster and luck in that also. But Carl got a residency in California, San Luis Obispo, and spent his life there as a pathologist. Actually, in the beginning, it was sort of an outpost. So he was a flying doctor that would go to outpost hospitals when there were surgeries and they needed a pathologist. They visited back and forth through the years. I knew Carl. My brother was the age of his 3 boys, and my brother and the boys traded vacations together. And Carl was always there for our life cycle events. And it was a lovely friendship. It was really a lovely friendship. He ended up, when he was a little boy, he wanted to be a cowboy. You know, all German boys wanted to be cowboys, and he did become a cowboy. He had a ranch, a 400-acre ranch in California, and had cattle. He really wanted to become a cowboy. In 2009, my father got a call from his housekeeper and said, Max, you need to come say goodbye to Carl. So that day, my brother and a nephew and my father went to say goodbye. And at that point, my father had written most of the book with Carl's help. They did a lot of talking about it. And he said to Carl, you know, Carl, this is one place that you and I cannot escape from. And Carl died. It was a big blow to my father. It was a big blow.
Such an amazing story. I think it is, in this week of Veterans Day, it's so important to remember these stories, these individuals, that when we talk about soldiers, that each one of them has a story, each one comes back with stories, and that it's not always straightforward who's the enemy, who's good, who's bad, where that lies. And this is such a great way of reflecting on that. I want to thank Nina, first of all, for joining us today. And I also want to thank our sponsor, Robin Cohen. If you liked this or any other Jewish Museum Milwaukee moment, please feel free to check out our website, jewishmuseummilwaukee.org. You can make a donation there. You can find lots of other awesome, interesting things. Thanks so much for sharing this moment with us.
My pleasure. Happy Veterans Day.